Hello guys, this is Dr. Sonali Mahatreya bringing to you our latest presentation on direct hyperbilirubinemia on my channel The Neonatal Hub. Now as you know, I have already posted a video before this which was discussing indirect hyperbilirubinemia. Now indirect jaundice is much more common in newborn babies as compared to the direct jaundice. Nevertheless, we'll be discussing direct jaundice in much more depth in this presentation. We have already discussed the anatomy and physiology relating to the hepatobiliary system in greater depths in our initial presentation, but we'll just be brushing up few of the details for those who have seeing it for the first time. So let's proceed. Now this is the basic hepatobiliary anatomy. As we see, this is the liver. The liver has a small bile duct. These then later on come together as the right and the left ducts, the hepatic ducts. Below there is a gallbladder from where the cystic duct comes, and together they form the common bile duct. The common bile duct then drains into the duodenum. So this is the basic physiology. This is the basic anatomy that we need to know. Now how exactly is bilirubin? We will discuss now. Now the physiology of bilirubin metabolism includes starts from the breakdown of RBCs. As we can see, there is a globin and the heme moiety. The globin moiety is the protein part and the heme is the one which forms bilirubin. Heme breaks down into bilirubin and ferrocyan. Now the bilirubin which is released from the breakdown of RBC then combines with albumin, and it is present in the plasma bound to albumin. Now this entire process of breakdown of RBC occurs in the spleen, and then we have our albumin bilirubin complex which is found in the blood. Now this complex is then taken up by the liver. In the liver, the bilirubin is taken up and the albumin is further released into the circulation. Now, this was the first part which we discussed, which was breakdown of RBC. Now, what exactly happens in the liver is conjugation. Now, conjugation, here the bilirubin which is uptaken by the liver, it combines with glucuronic acid in the presence of enzyme which is UDPG, uridine diphosphoglycerol transferase. Now this enzyme, it causes conjugation of bilirubin with glucuronic acid, and we get the conjugated bilirubin. The conjugated bilirubin is the water soluble form of bilirubin and it is excreted in biles. Now anything going wrong with the conjugation process obviously will lead to more amount of unconjugated bilirubin, which is then released into circulation, and we have indirect jaundice. However, if the conjugation has occurred successfully in the liver and we have the resultant conjugated bilirubin, but somehow there is a problem in the further transport of that bilirubin to the intestine, then this conjugated bilirubin will be released into blood, and thus we will be having a direct jaundice or direct hyperbilirubinemia or conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. The third step is when there is successful conjugation of the bilirubin and there is successful transport of the bilirubin into the intestine, here there is a bile breakdown which occurs by the gut bacteria. The gut bacteria then finally give rise to urobilinogen and stercobilinogen. The stercobilinogen is then excreted via the feces and the urobilinogen is excreted in the urine. So this is the basics that we need to know. I hope we are clear about the conjugation process, because this is the major process which determines whether we have indirect jaundice or direct jaundice. Now coming on to the topic of our discussion today, it's direct jaundice. It is defined as the measure of direct reacting bilirubin or conjugated bilirubin of more than 1 mg per deciliter in a total serum bilirubin levels of less than 5. Or when we know the total serum bilirubin levels, then more than 20% of these levels, if it is a direct bilirubin, then it is termed as direct jaundice. It is also known as conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. Now direct jaundice in a baby is a biochemical marker for cholestasis. It is indicator of hepatobiliary dysfunction. Now, to define neonatal cholestasis, it is defined as a prolonged elevation of serum levels of conjugated bilirubin beyond the first 14 days of life. Now, what are the causes of direct jaundice in a neonate? Now, we are concentrating on the neonate only. There are other causes of direct jaundice in the pediatric age group and the adult age group, but this is very specific for the neonatal age group. Now, the causes include extrahepatic biliary cause, intrahepatic biliary causes, hepatocellular causes, or certain other miscellaneous causes. Now, extrahepatic biliary causes include the most common, which is biliary atresia. We'll be discussing it a little further. Then we have choledochal cyst. The lesser common ones are bile duct stenosis, spontaneous bile duct perforations, neoplasms. Coming on to the intrahepatic biliary causes of direct jaundice, we have something known as intrahepatic bile duct paucity. Now, this intrahepatic bile duct paucity can be either syndromic or non-syndromic. When it is syndromic, we have the Algil syndrome. Don't worry, we have discussed the Algil syndrome in 1 or 2 slides further. So, we'll be brushing up what exactly this syndrome includes. And the non-syndromic part is PFIC, that is progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis. Moving on to the hepatocellular causes of direct jaundice, it can be caused secondary to metabolic disorders like alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, galactosemia, cystic fibrosis, tyrosinemias, etc. Or it can be even caused by infections like torch infections, Epstein-Barr, E. coli, streptococcus. Basically, sepsis can cause direct jaundice. Also, we need to be vigilant about urinary tract infection in neonates, which can also present as direct jaundice. And some other miscellaneous causes like total parenteral nutrition can cause direct jaundice, especially the lipid component of the TPN has been linked to direct jaundice. However, for direct jaundice to be caused, we need a prolonged TPN. That is, more than 3 weeks of TPN can be implicated in the as a causative factor of jaundice. Then it can be secondary to idiopathic neonatal hepatitis, neonatal hemochromatosis, and sometimes in cases of ECMO, the child can have direct jaundice as a residual. Now, coming over to how do we proceed when we have a patient presenting with direct jaundice. Now, first and foremost thing, and the most important thing, is the history. Again, before history, the first thing is that you look at the child. Does the baby appear sick? Also, ask the mother whether the baby is appearing sick. A mother can be the best determinant of the well-being of the baby. So, ask her whether the baby is same as since birth, or whether there has been sudden deterioration in the clinical condition. Then inquire about the gestational age and calculate the corrected gestational age as well. The maternal and neonatal blood groups have to be inquired about. What was the age of onset of jaundice and what has been the total duration of jaundice? As we have discussed, a jaundice which is for more than 14 days of life of a baby is neonatal cholestasis. Of course, when the jaundice is direct jaundice. Then inquire about consanguinity. As we have seen, many of the metabolic disorders are few of the causes. Then ask about the feeding history, whether there are any associated complaints in the child, like whether the child is vomiting, whether the child looks to be lethargic or irritable, because these can be some signs of metabolic disorders like galactosemia, for example, can present with a direct jaundice, hepatomegaly, and then suddenly going to lethargy and so on. Whether there was any history of NICU admission, if yes, then whether there was Any parenteral nutrition given? When was the enteral nutrition started? What about weight loss? Was it an early jaundice which was not responding to phototherapy, and now we have direct jaundice? Antenatal history of antepartum hemorrhage, premature rupture of membrane or preterm premature rupture of membrane, maternal diabetic mellitus, thyroid disorders in the mother, antenatal infections, all of these have to be inquired. Then what is the color of the urine and stools of the baby? What was the time the meconium was passed? Because a delayed passage of meconium along with jaundice can give you an early clue for either hypothyroidism, congenital hypothyroidism in the child, or you can keep an vigilance whether the child has cystic fibrosis, also can present in similar fashion. So we need to have these things in our mind. Then whether there is any family history of jaundice, anemia, any history of splenectomy in the family, any metabolic disorders, whether the previous sibling had similar jaundice, whether there are any neonatal deaths or morbidities which were reported in family members, especially even the mental retardation part, whether there are some family members who are like that. All these will give you a collective view, because as we know, the causes of direct jaundice are very vague. We need to have a proper detailed history so that we can have a differential diagnosis in place before even examining the child. Now coming on to the clinical assessment, first and the foremost thing, which I'll repeat myself, whether the baby appears sick, because the diagnosis as well as the treatment part will be affected by this. We in our next few slides we have an approach how to approach the case, so you'll come to know exactly why am I stressing over this point. Next comes the neurological assessment of the child. Specifically look whether the child is crying well, whether the child is arousable or non-arousable. Then comes the vital assessment, the weight assessment of the child, whether any weight loss is documented. The general nutritional assessment, whether the child has any signs of sepsis. We'll have to look at the child properly to find out if there are any dysmorphic features. What is the color of the skin? Generally, by look, the child with direct jaundice appears a little greenish yellow. However, there is no standard which says what color of the skin should be. So overall the child will look jaundiced, icteric to you. Then look for bruising, look for petechiae, because a liver failure will be indicated by this, and you need to start at least vitamin K, and of course the other fat soluble vitamins as well in this case. Then examine the child for hepatomegaly, splenomegaly, any palpable mass in the right abdomen which can point you towards cysts like choledochal cyst. Then whether there is any other abdominal mass, any distension. Ascites is very difficult to determine in a newborn baby, but yes, we'll keep that in mind as well. For syndromic associations, again evaluate the child whether there is any murmur, evidence of heart failure. And last and not the least, examine the diaper for the color of the urine and stool. Yes, the mother can tell you very well. However, it is always better to examine yourself. Now, this is the general workup, the lab investigations, the imaging, and the other workup as well. As you can see, the workup of direct jaundice is very vast. Like if a baby with direct jaundice comes to you and you tell the parents that we have to send the lab investigations of bilirubin, liver enzymes, GGT, PT-PTTK, proteins, ammonia, septic screening, urine reducing substance, torch titers, UA, PA, along with it the various imaging modalities and maybe even liver biopsy, then they are going to be really scared. It is very important to have a very proper approach towards a child with direct jaundice. So, how do we approach this child? Now, a neonatal cholestasis. A jaundiced infant who is approximately 2 to 8 weeks old. Stressing the point is very important. Does the child look sick to you? Now, yes is the green and the red mark will indicate no. Now, if the patient acutely ill, yes, then firstly manage the acute illness and consider your differential diagnosis as sepsis, urinary tract infection, galactosemia, tyrosinemia, hypopituitarism. For hypopituitarism, you will be looking at the midline defects, especially the gonads. Going from top to bottom, you'll have cleft lip, cleft palate, and so on. Then iron storage disorders, metabolic disorders generally presents in a sick child, and hemolysis because there can be associated severe anemia or even heart failure. So you need to manage the child and then look for the diagnosis. Now my patient is not acutely ill. I need to confirm it again whether it is a direct or indirect jaundice. So measure the serum direct bilirubin levels. Once we have confirmed that the serum direct bilirubin levels are more than 20% of the total serum bilirubin levels, then we come to the conclusion that yes, it is cholestatic jaundice. If no, then it is indirect hyperbilirubinemia. Evaluate and treat accordingly. Go back to our initial presentation, which was on indirect jaundice. There I have discussed the approach to the case of indirect jaundice as well. So you will go by that flowchart. Now we have a child with direct jaundice, which is cholestatic jaundice. Go back to the parents, go back to the child, take the history, the physical examination in details, especially considering direct jaundice. A urine analysis and urine culture is routinely indicated if the child comes to you with direct jaundice. As I have already said that urinary tract infection is one of the most common causes of jaundice in the child. Also, the UTI in a newborn child can present isolatedly as jaundice and there may not be any other associated complaints. So urine culture is very important here. Are there findings of any specific disease? Look into it. Now, if yes, then evaluate further. If you get UTI, treat your UTI and your jaundice will be treated. If no, then screen for galactosemia and hypothyroidism specifically. These are the conditions which are preventable cause of mental retardation or any brain damage. So these are the things we have to be the most vigilant about. If your center has a routine policy of newborn screening, then go back to your newborn screening and check whether there was any galactosemia, hypothyroidism positivity in the screening test. If not, then screen the baby for it. If something comes out to be positive, manage the case accordingly. Now, if there was any other disease and the management is done and the bilirubin normalizes by 6 weeks of age, good enough. If the bilirubin does not normalize by 6 weeks of age, then we have a problem. Now here consider GI problems. Now you have to send your battery of tests, including the complete blood count, the platelet count specifically. You will be ruling out sepsis, the bilirubin levels, the entire liver profile including the liver enzymes, PTTK. Liver is very essential for the protein metabolism, so the albumin will be checked. Urine reducing substances, again the galactosemia, don't forget it is a very important cause. Alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency can be a cause, so you will be checking for that, and a USG abdomen. Now, do you have a low alpha-1 antitrypsin? Do you have a choledochal cyst? Then further management accordingly. If no, then consider percutaneous liver biopsy or skin scan can be indicated. Now, is there any evidence of biliary obstruction in your child? If yes, then consider consulting a pediatric surgeon and operative cholangiogram will be required for it. If no, then further evaluate the child now for infection, for metabolic disorders, whether there are any genetic disorders or other causes, as we have said. So this is the proper approach which is needed when we have a case of cholestasis. Now let us discuss some of the causes in detail. The first and the most important cause of a direct jaundice or a neonatal cholestasis is biliary atresia. Now, biliary atresia is the most common cause of end-stage liver disease in infants, and it is a leading cause of liver transplantation in the pediatric age group. Its incidence is estimated to be around 1 in 8,000 to 1 in 12,000 per live births. It has a female preponderance. There is no excretion of bile from the liver into the duodenum, leading to cholestasis, fibrosis, and ultimately cirrhosis, which may require liver transplantation. Now, the hepatobiliary system anatomy we have already discussed in our first slide. The liver, the right and the left hepatic ducts joining to form the common hepatic duct. This further gets the cystic duct joining to it and forming the common bile duct. So, any of the atresia part in this duct joining can lead to your direct jaundice. So this is the main part we are worried about in biliary atresia. So this is the classification of biliary atresia, which is based on the extent and site of fibrosis in the biliary tree. In type 1, there is obstruction which is at the level of the common bile duct. So there will be the cystic duct will be joining the common hepatic duct normally, and then there is a altogether obstruction. In type 2, there is obstruction at the level of the common hepatic duct itself. That is, the cystic duct does not join at all. And the type 3, which is the most dangerous one, there is the obstruction at the level of porta itself, and all the ducts and all the other structures are not useful at all. This is the worst prognosis. Now we have one important cause of direct jaundice, which is idiopathic neonatal hepatitis, and this has to be differentiated from biliary atresia as they have very common presenting features. Now what we need to know is that the biliary atresia rarely occurs in family. However, the neonatal hepatitis, which is idiopathic, is generally familial. It has an early presentation. Sometimes the baby can be jaundiced at birth itself. Biliary atresia, however, will be presenting postnatally. The idiopathic neonatal hepatitis is more common in prematures and small for gestational age babies, and there is no such gestation-wise differentiation for a biliary atresia child. Biliary atresia, the child will have persistent acolic stools. And in neonatal hepatitis, there can be transient severe impairment in bile secretion. So the stools will be sometimes clay colored, sometimes yellow colored. In biliary atresia, there is a palpable liver with abnormal size and consistency, which is rarely seen in the neonatal hepatitis. And biliary atresia is associated with increased incidence of abnormalities like malrotation, livocardia, vascular anomalies as well. And there are no such associations in neonatal hepatitis. So a child presenting with biliary atresia will come to you with jaundice, which has been persistent for more than 2 weeks, acolic stools, dark colored urine. Occasionally there can be bleeding, which is secondary to vitamin K deficiency, and the child may present to us with bleeding. Then hepatomegaly and splenomegaly are documented on examination, and there can be associated ascites as well. So how do we diagnose it? The gold standard for diagnosis is exploratory laparotomy with intraoperative cholangiogram. Now, American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that any infant who is jaundiced at 3 weeks of age should have a total and direct bilirubin measurement. Ultrasonography is one of the modality being non-invasive. It helps in differentiating biliary atresia from other causes of neonatal cholestasis, as we can have absence of gallbladder, which can be a very important marker. Then there is hepatobiliary scintigraphy, which is again one of the non-invasive ways of ruling out extrahepatic biliary atresia. We have discussed it in one slide further. And liver biopsy is an important tool in evaluation of an infant with conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. It should be performed preferably within 8 weeks of age. And one more of the modality which is available is endoscopic retrograde cholangiopancreatography. This permits the visualization of the biliary tree in young infants, but it is technically very challenging in newborn infants and it is not generally used. Now, what is hepatobiliary scintigraphy? Most of us may be knowing this modality in terms of HIDA scan. Now, hepatobiliary scintigraphy with technetium labeled immunodiacetic acid derivatives, this differentiate biliary atresia from non-obstructive causes of cholestasis. This test is sensitive, but it is not very specific for biliary atresia. In biliary atresia, the hepatic uptake of the tracer is normal, but the excretion in the intestines is absent because, if you can recollect from the previous slides, there is no problem with the liver per se till the advanced stages when the liver can go into cirrhosis. But in the initial stages, what is defective is the duct system, which is post-hepatic. So the uptake will be normal, but the excretion is absent. Now this can be as HIDA, DICIDA and PIPIDA scans. This depends on what is the tracer which is used. HIDA is the one which is hepatobiliary immunodiacetic acid scan. Then there is diisopropyl immunodiacetic acid scan and para-isopropyl immunodiacetic acid scan. We need a phenobarbital dose to be given 3 to 5 days prior to the procedure for priming. That is, the enzymes, the liver enzymes have to be activated well. In the procedure, a radioactive tracer is injected through an accessible vein. This tracer then is uptaken by the liver, it is stored in the gallbladder and it should be excreted in the intestines. Now what happens when the child has biliary atresia? In the absence of disease, the radioactive tracer is visualized within 1 hour in the gallbladder. To the right of you, you can see one of the reports of the scan which was done. Dynamic images are taken at 20 minutes pre and post feeds, and static images are taken at 30 minutes, 4 hours and 24 hours after giving the dye. If the dye is not visualized within 4 hours, then it indicates cholecystitis or cystic duct obstruction. A delayed 24-hour film is indicated if no tracer is visualized in the intestines till then. If we visualize a tracer by 4 hours, then a 24-hour film is not needed. If the tracer gets excreted in the intestine and it is shown, then biliary atresia is ruled out. However, if there is no excretion, then either it can be biliary atresia or it can be severe neonatal hepatitis with interlobular bile duct paucity. And in this case, liver biopsy is indicated. So it is not very specific, but yes, it is very sensitive indicator. So how do we treat biliary atresia after we have diagnosed it? Now, early diagnosis of biliary atresia and surgical repair leads to a better outcome. The surgical modality is Kasai's surgery, which is hepatic portoenterostomy. Now, Kasai's procedure has the greatest chance of re-establishment of the bile flow and the long-term survival in the infants. The liver can have a very good survival if the surgery is done before 45 to 60 days. Now, liver transplant is selectively performed for those infants with progressive liver failure or those who have unsuccessful Kasai's procedure. So that was biliary atresia for you. We'll just have one slide each for rest of the causes because we need to know what they are. These are not very common, but yes, we need to keep it in the back of our mind whenever we have a child with direct jaundice. Now, choledochal cyst, these are congenital anomalies of the biliary tract with dilatations of the extrahepatic and sometimes the intrahepatic biliary system. After biliary atresia, choledochal cyst is the most common cause of obstructive jaundice in the newborn period. We don't have any known etiology. Choledochal cyst has a triad, which is very important to know. It has intermittent obstructive jaundice, abdominal pain, and a cystic abdominal mass. So any mass on the right side can be either your hepatomegaly, but very less likely, and more commonly it can be a choledochal cyst. Now, ultrasonography is the most common used diagnostic tool for diagnosis of choledochal cyst. The complications can include recurrent cholangitis. We can have biliary cirrhosis, rupture of the bile peritonitis, hepatic abscess, gallstones, and later cholangiocarcinoma of the cyst wall. And complete excision of the cyst mucosa is the treatment of choice here. Coming on to the intrahepatic biliary causes of cholestasis, as we have already discussed, these are the syndromic causes or the non-syndromic causes. In syndromic causes, we have a progressive familial intrahepatic cholestasis, that is PFIC. PFIC has genetic basis. There are 3 types of PFIC, 1, 2 and 3. It presents in the first few months of life and sometimes in the neonatal period. They commonly present in form of hepatosplenomegaly, failure to thrive, malabsorption, fat-soluble vitamin deficiencies, coagulopathies, and intractable pruritus in the child, which can present as irritability in the child. Then progression of cirrhosis is rapid without treatment. The treatment of choice is biliary diversion and ileal exclusion. Liver transplant is needed in many of the patients. Now, I'll not go into details of type 1, 2 and 3. We can discuss that as a separate topic on PFIC itself because it is a very vast topic. What we need to know is PFIC type 1 and type 2 are the ones which are common in the neonatal period and not type 3. Type 3 can be seen in adolescent age groups commonly. And coming on to the syndromic cause, we have the Alagille syndrome. Now what we need to remember is the face of an Alagille syndrome. The features include prominent forehead, deep set eyes, pointed chin, and a bulbous tip of nose. The commonest thing that can point you towards Alagille syndrome is the bulbous tip of nose. Then there is evidence of heart disease, so we need to look for murmur in these babies. There is butterfly vertebra, which we can see in the right-sided X-ray picture, and posterior embryo toxon. Now, the causes of direct jaundice can be infections or metabolic syndrome. I'll just be enumerating them, not going into much details. Infections include bacterial and parasitic infections and the viral infections. Bacterial infections which can have sepsis itself can cause direct jaundice. Then the other causes are syphilis, tuberculosis, listeriasis, toxoplasmosis. Not very common, but yes, there are a few reported cases of malaria which has presented as massive splenomegaly, hepatomegaly, and secondary to that, jaundice in the babies. And of course, urinary tract infections again. The viral causes are cytomegalovirus, herpes, rubella, the torch group itself, then the parvovirus, and the hepatic viruses also. The metabolic disorders causing neonatal cholestasis include galactosemia, tyrosinemia, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, cystic fibrosis. These are the most common 4 implicated ones. The others can be storage disorders like Gaucher's 2, then fatty acid oxidation defects, mitochondrial defects, bile acid metabolism defects primarily, or HLH, neonatal hemochromatosis. Now, the few of the miscellaneous causes in which we have our parenteral nutrition associated cholestasis. Now, this is seen in newborns who are on prolonged parenteral nutrition, that is more than 2 weeks. Risk factors include prematurity, short bowel syndrome, functional liver immaturity, sepsis, lack of enteral feeds, and possible toxicity from the components of parenteral nutrition. As you can see, most of these risk factors are in fact the risk factors for prolonged TPN. The clinical features are similar to the other cholestatic jaundice. Alternatively, causes of cholestasis also need to be excluded before coming on to the diagnosis. Now, hepatocellular and canalicular cholestasis, steatosis, and periportal fibrosis are seen on liver biopsy. Evolution of the biliary cirrhosis can occur with continued use of parenteral nutrition. The management, includes trophic enteral feeds. This can prevent the cholestasis, and for managing the cholestasis, we have to go to UDCA, which is also deoxycholic acid, which is 10 to 20 milligram per kg pt. Alternatives to the soy-based lipid emulsions, the SMOF, which is a very good TPN formulation, but yes, it has been linked to some causes of cholestasis as well. Then liver transplantation or a combined liver intestinal transplant may be only option in some of the patients with end-stage liver disease and extreme short bowel syndrome. Now, this short bowel syndrome, again you need to know, is very commonly associated with maternal diabetes. So, we need to have our antennas up if the mother is diabetic. Coming over to the management part of direct jaundice. Now, we have seen how to manage the cause of the cholestasis, but this is the general management which is required before you even reach the diagnosis. The management includes medical management. Here, certain special formulations like medium chain triglycerides and the MCT oils can be used, as it is absorbed better regardless of the luminal concentration of the bile acids. And breastfed cholestatic infants can be given supplemental MCT oils. Vitamin supplementation, especially the KDA regimen, which we say, the fat soluble vitamins K, E, D, A have to be supplemented, and dietary restrictions are needed only if the diagnosis asks for it, like specifically for our inborn errors of metabolism. This is one of the reference that I got. This is 2012 reference. It gives the target fat soluble vitamin levels and the replacement regimens which have to be given, as you can see, A, D, E and K. Now coming over to the pharmacological treatment, the first and foremost is UDCA, that is ursodeoxycholic acid. This helps cholestasis by substitution in the bile pool for more hydrophobic bile acids and stimulation of the bile flow. The recommended dose is 15 to 30 milligram per kg per day in divided doses. Generally, 2 divided doses are enough. The second drug is phenobarbital. It acts by inducing the hepatic microsomal enzymes that increases the bile flow. The recommended dose is 3 to 5 milligram per kg per day, and also it is used for priming before going for the scintigraphy. The third drug is cholestyramine. This drug binds the bile acids in the intestinal lumen. Therefore, it decreases the enterohepatic circulation of the bile acids and it leads to fecal excretion and increasing the hepatic synthesis of bile from cholesterol. Thus, it also decreases the cholesterol levels. So, thank you for watching this video. I hope this video has cleared many of your doubts regarding direct jaundice and the approach and management of this jaundice. And any of your queries or any suggestions regarding any topics in neonatology that you would like me to have our video presentations on are most welcome. If you like the video, please press like and subscribe to my channel, The Neonatal Hub. Thank you.